Thank you, Paul. What a great way of kicking off our conference today. And we got much more to come. My name is Morten Nielsen. I'm the current vice chair of the director here at the AESC and a senior partner at Whitkeefer and Whitkeefer International. It is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker at our conference, Rebecca Ray. I think that many of you are already familiar with Rebecca and a lot of her work. She's the Executive Vice President for the Knowledge Organization, Human Capital Practice Leader, and a Director of the Engagement Institute at the Conference Board. Founded in 1916, the Conference Board is a global, independent business membership and research association working for the public interest. It is one of the most highly respected research providers in the world. Rebecca is responsible for the overall quality and the continuing integration of the Conference Board's research and engagement efforts. She is also, as I mentioned, leader of their global human capital practice. Dr. Ray taught at Oxford and New York universities, where she also earned her PhD, and she led a consulting practice for many, many years, offering leadership assessment and development services to Fortune 500 companies. And as if that wasn't enough, she's also a very frequent public speaker, appearing as a guest in business media, and she's the author of numerous articles and books of very high value. I ask you please to join me in welcoming Rebecca Ray to our annual conference. I know you'll find her perspectives on the most pressing issues of the C-suite leaders fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. That was lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Much of that is true. And it's a distinct pleasure to be here with you today for a variety of reasons. We have a very close partnership with AESC, and you'll see that some of the highlights of the research that we'll be speaking about today is directly part of the success story that AESC was part of. You'll see some of the global folks we have the opportunity to partner with. But I also see a couple of firms represented here in the room who were directly responsible for some of my best career moves. So I thank you for that. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I so enjoyed the presentation that Paul made earlier. My mind is sort of swimming. But it was a great way to start to talk about the digital world that lies ahead and the ways in which organizations and its leaders can begin to prepare for it. So that's what I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about today. And in the time that we have, I'll share a few highlights. Perhaps if there's a few questions, I'd be happy to address those. And I'm also very happy to make this report a member benefit of those who are members of the Conference Board available to you as well, so that you can be prepared for the quiz that will inevitably follow. So I stand here, and I'm only one of three authors on this C-suite challenge. This is a report we've been doing since the late 90s. It has been focused solely on CEOs for many years. This year, we decided to expand it to the entire C-suite. We thought that we might have a richer dialogue and some comparisons that we can make by doing that as well. So there were, I think, 21 different titles that we reached out to try to capture the C-suite thinking across the many geographies and industries. Last year, I believe, Dr. Van Ark, who is our chief economist, spoke at this gathering. And our lead author is Chuck Mitchell, who has had a fascinating career, but is the point person for just about every single piece of research that comes out of the Conference Board. He's the last man to say, yes, this may go and have the torch on it. And so he is the ultimate dot connector. And it's a great privilege to partner with these two each year to write this report. So hopefully I will do them a service today in talking about their work as well. You know, as I mentioned, we reach out to C-suite leaders around the world, and we don't do that alone. Certainly in addition to AESC, there are a variety of media publications as well as management associations with whom we partner around the world, and they would reach out to their constituents and suggest that they participate. This year, we had more than 1,000 responses. More than 500 were CEOs themselves, and the balance were across the C-suite. And and when you read the report, which will be life-changing for you, in the back, there's all of the breakdowns of exactly which region, exactly which title, exactly the percentages, the size of the organization. But suffice to say, it was fairly representative across all categories. So this is the topic that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on today, because the focus of the report, and sometimes you don't know these things until you start to drift through the data, and you get a sense of just how impactful the digital transformation is that is upon us. And I thought, what a great way to build on Paul's insightful presentation, which is now what are folks going to do about it. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on these things, and hopefully it will maybe jog your thinking about one thing or another, although many of us are in recovery from Paul's. But before I step into this, let me just go back one slide if I could. I'm not sure that this is. Could we go back one slide? Thank you so much. So let me just talk for a moment about what we asked people. We did not ask every respondent every question. We asked CEOs virtually all the questions, but we asked some subset of the C-suite some questions. We didn't, for example, ask CHROs around sustainability or a few other things, but you'll see that they did weigh in occasionally on some questions. We asked folks to do two things. One was to talk about the perennial challenges that all organizations have, whether that's in human capital or customer service and relations, or it's in operational excellence. There are some things that are perennial challenges. And then we also asked them to talk about what we call the hot button issues, those things that are going to have a special focus in the next year or so. And that's very telling for us, because each year you can see what's on the minds of these C-suite leaders, and you can get a sense of what's where they're going to spend their energies. Now, over the years, we see topics rise and fall. Last year, fears of a global recession, that was the #1 in the hot button category. And that's what CEOs told us. Now, remember last year and all years prior, it was just the CEOs, and this is a little bit expanded. But here, too, you can see that there's a great deal of shift. There is not that worry anymore. So if we can, we'll just take a look quickly at some of the C-suite responses to the hot button issues. This is a little bit of an eye chart, but the report will be life-changing when you see it. But across the board, in every category, and among CFOs, CEOs, and CHROs, with the exception of Europe, the #1 hot button issue, the thing they're going to focus on in the next 12 months, is the failure to attract and retain top talent. And that beats out things like cybersecurity and terrorism and the U.S. leaving the Paris Accords and the impact of Brexit. That's what was uppermost on the minds of more than 1,000 respondents. So attracting and retaining talent is very important. Also are in the top 5, you have developing the next generation of leaders, very important across the way, in a top 5 selection for virtually all. Disruptive technology, which is the second one, is creating new business models because of disruptive technology. Second across the board, with the exception of Europe, where it was third. If you listen to any of the Senate proceedings with Mark Zuckerberg yesterday, you heard him say several times, among many other things that he said, but you heard him talk about the fact that they need to really take a look at their business model and their scope of responsibility in terms of, when they first started, it was about putting tools into the hands of users. And now it's about what's Facebook's responsibility in oversight. So even those who were disruptors themselves now are being disrupted, having to think about what business are we really in. I would say also that there's a couple of outliers that I'd just like to call out. You can see that new competitors globally is the #1 choice for respondents in Europe. And I think that that is a reflection of the fact that you're starting to see pickup even in Western economies now. And there are more entrants into the marketplace in a variety of ways. And we saw this not only from the data, but from the open-ended data that they also did, and also the follow-up interviews that we do with a cross-section of folks. Also important to CHROs, workforce diversity. They are also very concerned not only about workforce diversity, but also income inequality and disparity. And so you see those as higher ranking concerns among CHROs. Among CFOs, they are more concerned about trade, and they're also more concerned about global currency fluctuation. It should be mentioned also that when you look at hot button issues, it does not remove the immediacy of the regional issues. And so when you see, for example, on the earlier slide, China had among its top 10 economic uncertainty in China, but in the US, very concerned about the erosion of trust in institutions in the United States, and also concerned about tax reform and healthcare. Europe is very concerned about financial instability and the effects of Brexit, but these don't translate into global findings. So when we talk about the top 5, those are the top 5 among global all-in numbers, and that 2 of the top 5 have to do with talent and leadership. So when we think about the strategies that organizations are going to use for the perennial challenges that they have, I thought it might be interesting to compare the responses of CHROs and CEOs. Now, this is the global snapshot of data. There are more than 500 CEOs globally and 99 or 100, depending on the question, of CHROs. So again, these are the strategies that people force rank for addressing human capital challenges in general. So as you can see from this slide, uppermost in the minds of CEOs is that they need to communicate and ensure that their organizations communicate effectively from all angles. There's a great deal in all of these responses and in all of these topics, whether it's operational excellence or innovation or customer relations, it's around culture. It's a culture of innovation, a culture of customer service, a culture of accountability. So much of the focus of virtually every C-suite leader was around some kind of culture building, transparency, speak up culture. I think, this was fielded in the fall of last year, and you had just started to see the renewed interest in the headlines around speak up culture and the failure of organizations to create that speak up culture, which allows sometimes the organizational culture failure that allows the bad behavior or the abusive behavior that you see in virtually every industry, virtually around the world, government, not-for-profits, NGOs around the world. Also important to CEOs was the effectiveness of the senior management team, and rounding out the top 3 was providing training and development. Perennially, that's what CEOs always pick. And yet when you talk to those of us who are chief talent officer or CHROs, it's not that high. It's not that it's not important, we just think it's table stakes. But CEOs tend to look at something tangible and say, see, I gave my people training, I love them. And so for a lot of folks, it's just, part of doing business. So you can see the focus there is around, among CEOs anyway, around communication, around the senior management team into which they have the strongest window, and also training and development for the rank and file. CHROs, on the other hand, are more focused on leadership development programs. And again, this is global, so it makes a difference. If you're in the US or in Western Europe, you are looking at the exodus of talented leaders, right? And the baby boomers are finally leaving, Gen X is celebrating, it's wonderful. But if you are looking in Asia, obviously you are concerned about developing leaders because many of those young leaders have not seen the economic cycles that lie ahead. And so how do you prepare them for the inevitable shifts, and how do you prepare them to lead through all kinds of change, economic cycles, but certainly disruptive change as well. The second most important thing to CHROs was succession planning, which goes hand in hand. They're very concerned, obviously, and I'm speaking to a group of folks who place C-suite leaders, so you know as well as I do. The baby boomer generation, what's left of it in the workplace, even at its heyday, was large, but the millennial generation is even larger. And Gen X in the middle simply does not have enough bodies to fill the spots. So organizations are going to need to reach into that millennial population, and they're going to have to pull those people forward earlier in career than they might have been comfortable with. I will tell you that I am not at all concerned about the quality of millennial leaders. I hope that's your assessment too. We did some work last year on millennial leaders. There's a lot in the media around millennials in general, right? Much of it is specious, much of it is trying to capture a headline, and much of it is because you had a random interaction with someone and you use that as the proxy for an entire generation. I think what happened to this generation is that they were tagged early on, and because of social media, that stuff doesn't go away. I think back to my early adult years, and I am very glad that there was not social media, because that stuff never goes away. It's not that I was really bad. I mean, really, I'm on probation now, it's all good. But I would hate to have that kind of record. I mean, that's the world in which they've grown up, which is a very different experience than many of us in the room have had. But we did this study. We had 14 iconic companies like Johnson & Johnson and American Express and Xerox and a variety of others. And so we spoke to sitting CEOs, their C-suite, millennial leader cohorts, and we looked to see whether or not this generation of leaders was inherently different from other generations, or was simply that some of the differences were more attributable to life stage. So that was our hypothesis going in, that it was not, and that's what we found. I had the privilege of sitting in front of folks like Ken Chenault and Ursula Burns, or Alex Gorski and asking them about their leadership journey, but I also had a chance to hear from millennial leaders at companies like Boeing, where they're talking about the scope of their role, which was just massive. And they were articulate and they were bright and they were passionate. So I'm not at all worried about this generation of leaders coming into the workplace. I think there's a great deal that they bring to the table. Differences, yes, but I think we should all be fairly relieved. But CHROs are concerned about if we can do that, can we do that quickly enough? And as you know, in leadership development, you're making a bet. You're making a bet on a future organization that a leader will need to be prepared to lead. And it's a lot like forecasting the trajectory of a hurricane. If you're off by 1 degree early on, there's a big cone of uncertainty in there. And so when you're developing leaders, it's really about, can you make an accurate assessment of what you think the world will be, and can you prepare people quickly enough and in enough numbers to satisfy the needs of the organization? Very concerned about leadership development and succession. They're also concerned about integrating employee engagement into all the business units. And those were the top 3 for CHROs. Very concerned about that. I think particularly you see this in the United States, more so than other regions, who I think were earlier to the party on employee engagement and what that might mean to an organization. But they are very concerned about having that be embedded in the business strategy, not as a standalone. I do a lot of work in the engagement space, and it's amazing to me how much effort and how much money is spent in that space and how little overall improvement there has been. And yet there are people in their own industry verticals who've cracked the code and figured out a way to be the magnet for top talent in their industry. So it's possible, it's just not easy. If we take a look at another perennial challenge around customer relationships and corporate brand and reputation, the CEOs picked as their top to enhance the quality of products and services and to engage personally with key customers and clients. Their third was the CHRO's first one, which is to develop a more outward-looking, customer-centric culture. That was their number 1. But what was interesting to me is that CHROs ranked more highly than did CEOs these 2 things: employed big data analytics to better understand shifts in customer patterns, and create more products and service customization through digital technologies. Those were the CHROs talking about this. And that was, I think, reflective of 2 things. 1, an understanding of where the business will need to go, and secondly, panic about not having the organizational capacity to deliver on it. If we look at innovation, both CHROs and CEOs both wanted to create a culture of innovation that encourages cooperation across functions and business units and promotes risk-taking. But CHROs were much more determined to hold leaders accountable. And you see this among CHROs in many parts of the report. Much of the data would indicate that it's one thing to say it's important, it's another then to move your performance management as well as your compensation structures to reflect rewarding good behavior in any of these different areas. So that was high for CHROs. Here's something else that was high for them. Develop managers and leaders to promote idea sharing in teams. Now, we see that come up a couple of times, certainly here in the innovation space, but we also know it from the research that we've done, separate from this particular project, around engaged leaders. And we look at leaders and we think, well, what's different from those highly engaging leaders, those that can motivate and inspire and engage and develop their people? What's different about them? What do they do differently, do to a greater degree than other leaders who are merely very good? The most highly engaged leaders have a couple of things that distinguish them. One is that they're a servant leader and that they are very other-centered. And that's not something you can train for. That's something that's a selection process. But what they also do is that they share ideas and really solicit the ideas and opinions of those on their team. And that was the single most defining difference between those who were highly engaged and those who were merely engaged. Now, we work with some of the world's best companies in terms of their highly engaged organizations and what they do to have one that is part and parcel of a fabric of engagement. And we also asked them if we could have access to some of their highly engaged leaders, however their selection process is. And they gave us access, and that's what we distilled out of all the interviews and all the survey data, is that that's what they brought to the table to a greater degree than did other leaders. I think holding folks accountable was, as I mentioned, an important one. But notice that the CHRO, the last one that's circled there, number 5, a higher rating than those of CEOs. They want to see more development and innovation for all employees. Now, when we first started asking this set of questions about 5 or 6 years ago, we had a selection that you could choose from, and CEOs, at the time it was just CEOs, they would say, we want to develop innovative skills for a select few. And developing innovation skills for all employees was like at the bottom. I'm only showing you the top 10, but there's like 23 or so responses that they could pick from. And we have watched this particular strategy move up the ranks, where at least CHROs, and some years it's a little higher with CEOs, understand that you cannot bet the ranch on 7 special people who meet every Tuesday in a particular conference room. You know, this is about building an idea among all employees about how they can think differently about the business, how they can improve products and services, and how they can bring additional value. So if we look at the challenge of operational excellence, and here we see that improving organizational flexibility and agility, and we'll talk in a moment about how companies are looking to transform themselves, and this is one of them. It's around agility. That was number 1 among CEOs and CHROs. CEOs also thought it was important to seek better alignment between strategy, objectives, and organizational capacities, which is a very comforting thing, and then investing more in new technologies. CHROs, on the other hand, notice again, they've picked redesign business processes to strengthen digital transformation as their second. And the third one is to improve the use of big data. Now, in my profession, I think we spent a lot of time helping people be very concerned and freaking out about the advent of human capital analytics. It's coming. You've got to have, and I will tell you that when I first started to talk about this, I spoke with several CHROs, and they would tell me they hoped that they could exit from the stage before they would be actually forced to know how to do this. We've come a long way. But I think it's very uneven in the profession. But when you think about the landscape that they look at now, it is very apparent that those are part and parcel of wise talent decisions, as well as how they will reinvent themselves. So the next question is around how these organizations are looking to shift and change. Paul made the point earlier that change is coming, and some of it also looks like continuity. And so you're looking at an evolution here. And the future has arrived. It's just not evenly distributed, and we've all heard that quote. And so some companies are well on their way through digital transformation, and many are not. In fact, last year when we started to ask about digital transformation, we asked CEOs if they felt confident that they had the leadership team to take the company through a digital transformation. Only 10% said that they were confident that they had that. So we started to dig a little bit more into digital technologies in terms of what leadership qualities would be necessary. So just so that we're sort of on the same page, when we talk about this digital transformation, it is creating new opportunities, but it does create certainly a sense of risk and opportunities. So when we look at the new world of work, we asked CHROs to tell us what they thought the workforce of the future in the next 3 to 5 years would look like. They told us quite a bit. This is a little hard to see, but the dark blue bars are those where they strongly or somewhat agree, and on the far end is that they somewhat or strongly disagree. Okay? The bottom line here is that they anticipate that the workforce will be predominantly comprised of something other than traditional full-time employees. So the second one down is the percentage of directly hired contingent workers and freelancers will increase. Almost 80% said yes, they agreed. The percentage of workers from managed service providers, 64 and change agreed. Percentage of outsourcing partners and offshoring partners would increase, 58%. The percentage of digital labor, i.e., robotic process automation or bots, will increase 77%. And I anticipate that work will increasingly be done in a crowdsourced community of customers and consumers, 48.9% agreed. Only 11.8% said that they don't anticipate any appreciable difference in the workforce in the next few years. Now, we did not ask them at the same time, where are you on your digital journey? Maybe this 11% represents, at least in part, those who feel that they're well on their way, and they already have many of these differences well in hand or well underway. I doubt that that's the case. But what you can see here is that people do anticipate a different future, and they do anticipate that there's going to have impacts. So we did ask a little bit about that as well. So when we asked CEOs and CHROs to talk about some of the challenges that they thought would be inherent in this new mix of workers, this is what they told us. So you have the CEO column on the left, and to its right, the CHRO column, okay? So both groups agreed that finding workers with the right set of skills was going to be the number one impact, number one challenge. Now, with that comes the war for talent and wage inflation and all of those things, but that was their very, very top concern. Notice that they're also fairly concerned about engagement and retention of non-traditional employees. Both groups rank that more highly than the engagement and retention of traditional full-time employees. So they're more concerned about the engagement level of the contingent worker who's the fill in the blank, you know, the gig, the temporary, the Hollywood model, whatever it is you want to call it, you know, that coming together for a project like a Hollywood film and then disbanding and coming back together with a different project. Those are the kinds of things that they're concerned about. Less so about the impact on traditional full-time employees. You know, we have a transition going on now, right? And so I don't think employment law is quite caught up to the mix of things that are happening in the workplace. And it's also a riskier bet. You need those skills. You don't have time to train and groom people. You're going to reach into the open market and get the best you can for the price that you can afford to pay. And that person will come and perhaps do a fabulous job. And then they will leave. And they take your IP or your, you know, the experiences or everything else the door right there with them. Okay? And you also have less control over them. You can't have them. Well, you can in some cases, but you don't have quite the control you would over, let's say, a departing employee. And so the concern is, how will that work? And it isn't about simply the high cost of non-traditional employees. That's not as much of a concern as it is not having them to begin with. If you can't execute against a strategy because you don't have the skill set in-house in some form or fashion, that's a bigger problem than what you had to pay to get the skill set you need. Right? So those were their concerns. Notice the CHROs were more concerned about labor law and government regulations, and I think that's because the law hasn't quite caught up. There haven't been enough cases, enough precedent to kind of catch up with some of the challenges that are you know, in the workplace now. I think one other thing that I might mention is intellectual property, and I mentioned that just briefly. I think there's a bigger issue here too, and when we spoke to some of these folks in interviews, they were very concerned that in many cases, these non-traditional workers are the point of contact for valued customers. And so how much are you willing to bet that that contractual employee, and let's just use that in the broadest possible sense, is going to have the kind of customer service that will allow you to feel comfortable with this? So there's some of that, and there is also the concern about intellectual property, and also the engagement rates. I had the great good fortune to speak with Carl Camden, who is the recently retired CEO of Kelly Services. And I learned a lot from him over the years. He served on our board of trustees at the conference board. And he talked a lot about the kinds of workers that he places. And I have to say I was unaware, for example, that many of the highest skilled scientists at the National Institutes of Health were folks that he'd placed. And he talked a lot about culture. And he talked a lot about the fact that when people have a reputation for a strong or a challenging culture, that determines the price that he can charge. So a bad culture filled with, let's say, uncaring managers or an unsupportive culture, or a culture in which, you know, we're still badging contract or non-traditional employees differently and making them come in through a different entrance, or making them, you know, not have any training because we don't want to have anyone think that they could possibly be an employee. You know, what does that do to morale? They're sitting next to each other on the floor in the, you know, in the open space. So what does that do to a culture? And I don't think we've figured out how to get that right yet. You know, when we do employee engagement surveys, most companies don't even include anyone who isn't a full-time employee. Don't include sometimes those who are represented by a union. So, you know, you're getting a coalescence around where's the line here, how does that blur? And CHROs are pretty concerned about how that's playing itself out. They do want a high-performance culture. And here you have in the blue, these are all CEO respondents. So you have the global CEO in the first column, and then you have it by region, and then we compare it with the CFO and the CHRO, okay? Virtually, on a global basis, you have a lot of coalescence at the top of the house, more or less, in most of these areas. They want to improve their organizational agility, and I'll come back to that in a moment in terms of what that actually means. But they want better alignment between strategy, objectives, and organizational capability. Notice how important that is in Asia. And notice also the second one for Asia is to better align compensation and incentives with business performance. So this is about accountability, and this is about driving performance, a high-performance culture through that. There's also investing in new technology, but raising employee engagement to drive productivity. Every time I see this come up this high in this challenge year over year, it's clear to me that organizations understand the linkage between higher rates of engagement and higher levels of productivity. It's not easy to do, but they understand the linkage. A couple of other things. Create and maintain a culture of accountability, number one for the United States. Number one. And I think also among CFOs, they were concerned about continual process improvement, but so were CHROs. That was their second choice. So I was pleasantly surprised to see how many of the CHO responses this year were around disruptive technologies, redoing the business models, using analytics and big data. So this is another example of that as well. Notice that CHROs also want that culture of accountability, just the way US CEOs mentioned that as well. They also want innovation to drive growth. So when you look at some of the responses here, across the board, with the exception of Asia, it was create a culture of innovation that encourages cooperation across functions and business units that promotes risk-taking. The number one reason why they will always say they want innovation is to drive growth. It's never about cost savings. That's usually at the bottom of the list. But this is about driving growth, and that's how they see it. In Asia, the number one was adopt a user-centered design approach to innovation to develop deeper understanding of customer needs. I would say CHROs, it was very important to them to develop managers and leaders to promote idea sharing in teams. That's the same response choice they had earlier, but again, they go back to this, which tells us there's a lot of validity about that, is that they are looking for managers who are closest to the teams, who are closest to the customer or closest to the issues to promote idea sharing, to take that and bubble it up. There's also ensure more diversity and inclusion on innovation products, teams and projects. That was number 10 among CEOs globally. It was in the top 10 was number 7 for CHROs. We know from some of our other research that the most innovative companies tend to have more inclusive cultures. And there's a direct correlation between inclusivity and a speak-up culture and innovation. And so that is not as a surprise to me. And notice also that CHROs have the highest ranking, number 5, versus 8 or 9 for everybody else, in developing innovation skills for all employees, as we talked about before. So they understand the linkage between innovation and culture. So a couple of things here. Now, this is how to read it. So these are the CEO, CFO, and CHRO responses. The questions are, do you agree or strongly or somewhat agree versus strongly or somewhat disagree? So my organization fosters a culture of diversity and inclusion. A lot of agreement. High numbers across all of those different groups. Great. My organization promotes a culture of continuous learning, something we know is a factor in innovation. Great. High numbers as well. 88 and change for the CEOs, 93% for the CHRO, who probably has the best, clearest line into actually who's getting developed and how. And my organization is willing to invest in anticipation of returns over a 3 to 5 year strategic horizon. 73% of the CEOs agreed, 75 CFOs, and 69% of the CHROs agreed. So that's all good. We believe in innovation. We're going to get there through inclusion, through training our people, and investing for the long term. Okay? It's all great. But here's where they struggle. Because when they look at the short-term results, they don't see the payout. So here's a question. Overall, how satisfied are you with your company's ability to innovate? CEOs weighed in as extremely satisfied at 7.2%. CFOs at 9.3% and CHROs at 8.9%, but that's abysmal. If we say that innovation is going to be the fuel for growth and we are disappointed with the results, something's wrong. Part of it, we would argue, is measuring, and I'm going to come to that in a second. But here's the other one. It says, my organization is a technology leader in this industry. CEOs, 48% agree or strongly agree. The rest don't. Not leading in technology, not mastering it. CFOs at 39% and CHROs at 43%. Here's the kicker. My organization has a process to measure innovation. It's the holy grail, but we don't know it when, we don't know how to articulate it. And if we can't measure it, we can't tell what the progress against the goals are. So only 44% of CEOs agree strongly or somewhat that they do have a process to measure. CFOs say 31% and CHROs say 35%. So the measurement, and I think this is what you're starting to see from CFOs and CHROs, is that this culture of accountability, the ability to measure, the use of big data, the use of analytics to make informed decisions, that's what's missing. So they want an agile organization. And in this eye chart, it talks about effective and engaged change leaders, a top choice for all three groups, CEO, CFO, and CHRO. They want resilient employees who can adapt. They want a transparent speak-up culture. They want communication that's effective and big data analytics. And that's how they think they're going to be an agile organization. Because we asked them specifically, what are the strategies or what are the ways in which you're going to be an agile organization? Now, it didn't have much to do with technology. And it had some things to do with, eliminating functional silos and those kinds of things and accountability. But it did not have a lot to do with how well they mastered the technology. We did ask in this digital transformation that is upon all of us, what are the qualities you need in leaders? So when we talk about digital transformation, it isn't around mastery of technology per se, it's what you do with it, right? So it's how you take the new technology and the data and insights you get from it, and how do you use that to connect everything that your organization touches so that you can drive productivity and growth. So here's what they told us. They want a strategic thinker, and this is now global CEOs right here, and then you have the CEO in the other blue, the lighter blue, right? So strategic thinker, highly adaptable, entrepreneurial, inspiring and engaging, and emotionally intelligent. Those are the top 5 CEOs on a global basis. Terrific. You can see that those are more or less some of the top 5 choices for others. But notice that both CFOs and CHROs thought that being inspiring and engaging was the most important attribute. Because I think they are maybe a little closer to some of these business groups. Certainly CHROs have a clear line of sight into many of their leaders, and the ones who are more engaging can often back that up with higher rates of performance. Notice that in China, emotional intelligence was ranked much more highly. Much more highly. And their second choice is a strategic thinker. And down at the bottom, they're the only one with the top 5, the only CEO group with the top 5 where tech savvy was one of the choices. So a distinct, different regional worldview about what makes a great transformational leader. The other thing I might call out is, a collaboration and learning agile among CHROs, that those were also top choices, because I think it goes back to their understanding of the ability to execute the strategy against the organizational capacity that you have. So we also asked one other question, and we asked CEOs and we asked CHROs and others, what are you doing to nurture digital talent? And CEOs are much more confident than the CHROs are. In fact, many of the CHROs, in another question, talked about the fact that they don't even have a strategy to retain digital talent that's critical. So there's some homework that I think needs to be done and some organizational preparation to make sure that once you've found them, which is going to be tough, and once you've groomed them and developed them, which takes time, how do you make sure that you keep them? So those are just a few of the highlights in terms of the kinds of things that we're finding. There's a great deal more in there, and I would love to continue to talk for a long time, but maybe if we have a few minutes, we can just ask a question or two if we have time. I know I think, right at the mark, but if there's anything that folks have as a question.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Why do you think Asia ranked so low on accountability on a couple of your scales?
You know, we asked most questions multiple ways.
Okay.
And a lot of what we saw in several of the Asian CEO responses was better alignment between performance and accountability, and better alignment between compensation and performance. So we did see that often. There are times, though, where it was lower. And I think it depends on the question that is embedded in what we were asking. Because in a forced choice, some things are going to naturally go to the bottom. And so it's not that it's not important, it's just in the context of that particular question, it may have come out differently. So I'll give you a perfect example. For many years, I struggled with this. American CEOs would say that diversity and inclusion as a strategy for human capital was ranked very low. And yet I know there's been a great deal of attention, a lot of CEOs at the forefront, a lot of great work being done in many organizations, and I didn't understand that. And so when we interviewed many of them, they said, well, you know, it's not that it's not important, it's just when you give me a forced ranking, this is where it goes. We've done a lot, we've made a lot of progress, we're not done, but you know, in terms of where my focus is going to be in the next 12 months, here's where it is. So sometimes that accounts for the variability in the rankings. Thank you for the question. Another question? I know I stand before you and a break, which is better than usually I'm between a group and the cocktail hour, and that's always a fun spot, always a fun spot. Well, then let me suggest this. I'll close. I know that we have the privilege of serving many of our wonderful member companies at the conference board, but also we have a public mission. We had that since 1916, and that's a large part of what we do. So I'll just leave you with this. If there's a way that I can ever be of service, please let me know. But I thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. We'll now take a 30-minute break. Thank you to Invinius for the sponsorship, and we'll see you back here at 11:30.